were. And certainly there's a lot of questions left about what friends of theirs might have known about them. But there was no organized. I think you have to look at Harris and Klebold primarily as the people involved here. I mean, certainly the ballistics tests indicate there wasn't a third shooter. And you have to look at their particular relationship and how they
talking about. The issue was how certain people were treated in post-Columbine, and how the people who wanted to homeschool their children were told they weren't supposed to do that, and yet they told other kids be homeschooled. The people who homeschooled their kids failed. The kids who were sent home, they all passed. You spent the first part of the article on a woman, Melissa Souder, I think is how she pronounces her name. Talk about Melissa and what happened to Melissa.
Well, this was revealing to me on a couple of points. Melissa was a freshman at Columbine last year. She knew Eric Harris just in passing. He was one of the people she would sit and talk about what was wrong with the school. She was, kind of a goth kid. She says that she was harassed by jocks, that she complained to teachers, and they did nothing.
She said, and I read from this, and I would recommend you picking this piece up. When she tried to come up with this, let me read the part. She said, the question is more troubling when you consider how school authorities have dealt with Melissa Souder, who knew Klebold and Harris only slightly. In her first few weeks at Columbine, Souder ditched class several times, resulting in parent conferences and restrictions imposed on her ability to leave campus during the day. But when she tried to complain to teachers about harassments by jocks, she was told, deal with it.
Right. But what's interesting is the contrast in how they treated her and somebody like Eric Harris, because what happens eventually is she ends up in the dean's office one day over something minor, and the dean's asking her what she thinks about all day. And she says, I think about blowing up the school. The school makes me that angry. Well, that becomes a red flag to them, and they really, from her parents' opinion, overreact to this remark. They consider it a threat. They follow her around. They question her if she's on school grounds early. Her life becomes miserable. It becomes even more so after the shootings, but that's another story. But in the meantime, you've got Eric Harris here, who's a guy who is a senior, a much more confident student, knows a lot more people, is going around talking about blowing up the school. He has an arrest record. He has been putting death threats on the internet against another student. And my question is, guess which one of these two the school authorities really devoted more scrutiny to?
They bear down on her.
Yeah, and Eric Harris doesn't stand out at all. And that says something to me about what was going on at Columbine, that there were a lot of students exhibiting resentment against jocks. There were a lot of sort of fashionable, trendy people talking about pipe bombs or things like that. And I mean, maybe not a lot, but enough that this did not stand out. Their essays did not stand out. The whole violent fantasy world these two guys were in was not that remarkable.
13 after 7:13. Good morning, 6:30 KHOW with Peter Boyles on a Friday. I would urge you to read this. Alan Prendergast's piece, The Enemy Within, The Lessons and the Lies About Columbine, front page of the new Westword. You write, you say hours after talking about how we got our perceptions and conceptions of Columbine. I read, hours after the onslaught began, an ace investigative reporter at Channel 9 KUSA announced the Trenchcoat Mafia was a tight-knit hate group with national ties.
Right.
Who was the reporter?
I believe that was Ward Lucas.
Is it true?
Did he say that?
No. No. Is it true? Because we all believed that.
No, one of the parts of the confusion of this is the internet, which I think also confused reporters in the first few days. People were desperately scouring, trying to find information, and there was a lot of bogus stuff being posted. There's a bogus suicide note by Eric Harris that you will still find on some of the websites. There's a lot of bad information on the internet. There were a lot of people who got onto this and made stuff up and put it out there. There's no Trenchcoat Mafia website. There's nothing that group ever had of that.
I got some of that mail. I think I still have it somewhere in the archives.
Yeah, I mean, there's no legitimate one. Let me put it that way.
So let's begin with that one, because we all believed that this was connected to other schools, and other schools were going to go up, and there was a West Coast connection and an East Coast connection, and the boys in Florida, and all this was going to happen. The truth of it?
Well, I think you have to look very closely at Columbine. Going back to Massacre for a moment, what that showed me is that the school had the capability to at least try to identify problem students. The problem was, how do you decide which is the problem student? Who do you decide which is violent? Is it going to be this freshman, or is it going to be this senior who has demonstrated a capacity?
Has a criminal record.
Yes.
Has threatened people.
You should be looking at.
Is a bomb maker.
Right. And that raises questions about how well the school is communicating with law enforcement.
We'll continue with the lies of Columbine. It's 15 after the hour, 7:15. I'm Peter Boyles. Channel 7 and 11 this morning on 7 Speak Out. We will talk about the Alabama killings. This is now part of the landscape of the country. Chuck Green will speak with us about why his column was returned to the Denver Post. 40% chance for showers and thunderstorms. Local rain in the city and in studio, and it's just an amazing piece. Alan Prendergast's piece, The Enemy Within, about what took place at Columbine. We're talking about the lies before we get into so many other issues. We were talking about what first emerges in the media, and you write, the day after the killings, the Washington Times reports that Klebold and Harris admired the Gothic scene and Satan worship, sometimes donning makeup in the style of one of their heroes, shock rock star Marilyn Manson. Sometimes they wore swastikas. Now, remind everyone that downstairs here on the FM side, they had Marilyn Manson booked for a concert, and they canceled Marilyn Manson.
Right. Yes, and ultimately it turned out that they're not Marilyn Manson fans. They're not goths. I mean, This is again the confusion with the trench coat.
Were they Satanists?
I can't find any evidence of that. Although you can look at some of the drawings and some of the interest in doom and some of the things he says about being God, and depending on how you interpret that. But there's clearly, it's not as simple as people want it to be. I mean, they want this to be,
When I finished this piece, I had a lot more questions than I had when I began. Go on. 2 days after building on the sketchy reports in the Denver Post, the New York Post announced that killers, quote, rehearsed their rampage in morbid videos that they made for the school, in which trench-coated Harris and Klebold pretend to shoot jocks.
Right, and that's become one of the major. One of the major criticisms of the school district is how could they allow them to shoot these videos? Well, we have yet to get any kind of official confirmation that such a video exists. I have not talked to anyone we were talking a little bit about this off air. I have not talked to anyone that has seen that video. I have heard there was at least one video in the production class that was not aired because of something the instructor saw on it. There is another video that was in a marketing class and apparently didn't attract a lot of comment, where they marketed a protection service. They were doing a commercial for protection service and pretended to shoot one guy. Now, if that guy was supposed to be a jock, I don't know. But it seems difficult for me to believe that they could have actually filmed at the school a very elaborate scenario of them going through the school shooting people. I just don't see how that would happen.
So that story's not true,
as far as we know. I mean, again, we haven't seen the videos, and so we've been getting different information about what's on them.
And Brian has a whole fix on the videos, saying the kids say one thing, the administrators say another thing.
That's right.
And as Brian said, as he's dealt with the administration at Jeffco, he said, "I believe the kids."
Yeah, but I have yet to find a kid who's actually seen it. I mean, I guess that's where I would hesitate about that.
A couple of weeks ago, you write in the piece, the Rocky Mountain News reiterated that during the massacre, Klebold and Harris said they were targeting athletes because they felt they ruled school life and needed to be brought down.
Well, that seems to me to be an interpretation of a comment that several people heard when they went in the library, which is all jocks stand up. And yeah, you could say that certain people may have been singled out because they looked like athletes, and then several of the people who were killed were athletes. But when you consider the larger picture of what was happening here, this wasn't, these people hurt me and I'm going to come in and fix them. This was, let's blow up the school. and let's take ourselves with it. I mean, there's no question in my mind that they didn't expect to emerge from this thing. They were trying to set off this 20-pound propane bomb in the kitchen, which would have killed lots of people, including probably them, from the, depending on the distance which they were firing at it.
It's almost Gotterdam wrong,
Yeah, I mean, these are two people that really have no particular concern about anybody else's life. I mean, to say they're targeting jocks in particular is to kind of give the thing a wrong cast. The larger question that comes out is, what makes you hate your school that much? Why would you do this at the school? I mean, if you're going to kill yourself, there are lots of ways to do this. Teenagers do some dramatic things, but why do it in this kind of public setting? Why taking down people, some of whom consider themselves your friends?
Then you do bios on, or at least not sketchy bios. It's probably the best bios I've read of these people. Eric Harris. If we had someone sitting in this room or listening to the show who knew nothing at all about Eric Harris, I need to take a pause here. Who would you tell them Eric Harris was? And you do include some of those sketches, and they do have this weird horned, strange person in some of their sketches. But he could appear for all kinds of different reasons.
Well, there's a very specific reason he's there. We can talk about that.
But the strange part about it, going back over what you said, the original things that I certainly believed, and I suspect most of the audience believed, simply aren't true.
Well, I think there's some truth in a number of them, but you have to look at it in a larger way, and that means trying to understand the particular violent fantasy world these two guys were in.
We'll come back, and Alan will begin. Just in fact, who were Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold? Chuck Green at 8 o'clock. His we got to get his mic. You know what? Can you move over to this mic over here? I'm very sorry. They try that one if you would. That's a terrible chair. And crack staff. Pull the mic there. I hope this one works. Let's see what happens.
Good morning.
Yeah, thanks. All right, that one works.
The two places that it appears they never went were the gym and the weight room, which, of course, is where you find jocks.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that just goes to the idea that this is not about settling a particular score. It's not revenge in that sense. It's something larger and, in many ways, much more frightening.
Was there a hit list? I mean, I've heard people say that there is a list that the Jeffco sheriff has now with a list of names.
Yeah. There is a list. The Jeffco Sheriff's Office doesn't call it a hit list because the people who were killed were not the people on that list.
Right.
But there was a list of athletes that Harris had, probably one of those lists of people he hated. And some of those people were still at Columbine, and some of them had graduated by the time of this attack.
Your son wasn't on the list.
Oh, no, not at all.
See what I mean?
Yeah. Well, I mean, several of the people who were killed had not been at Columbine all that long. They didn't know these guys. They weren't in a position to have offended anybody. I mean, it's as random as you can get. It seems to be whoever was in their line of fire that they just decided they'd shoot.
In the military, they were called targets of opportunity.
Yeah.
And they were there. They were your opportunity.
Yes.
Do this. So you were talking, and I was asking you to do this. Profile, if you would, of someone who never knew anything about Eric Harris. What did you find out?
The target of opportunity is an interesting phrase because where you start with understanding Eric Harris is this fascination with doom, which it's been mentioned a lot, but I don't think anybody's looked at it that closely. This is a first-person shooter game, and it's a game that a lot of kids work their frustrations off on, and they don't turn into mass murderers. But it is a game that desensitizes you a certain amount because you get used to firing at things and they blow up, and there's no consequence to you basically in doing this. Harris became a Doom designer. I've played some of his Doom wads. I mean, these are the levels of the game that you make up for yourself, and then you distribute it to other players. And he was very hungry for comment on these things. He had sent them out, posted them on his website, kept bragging about how good they were. Since his death, they've been reviewed by real Doom, players, designers who say these are pretty lame. But what's revealing about them is the degree to which he concentrated on setting up situations where you just really had to wade through as many of these things as possible. It becomes a very tedious killing spree.
And he just simply kills.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very. To me, it was revealing about his personality to play his games and see both how hungry he was for somebody to acknowledge what he was doing, and at the same time to see how he set up these situations that in most Doom games would be considered unsporting or just tedious.
I asked you both this question during the pause. When do you think the two made the decision to do what they did? This is part of this Was it when, and you have an interesting response to this because, as we know, Eric Harris tried to join the Marine Corps. The Marine Corps found out he was taking a drug called Luvox and said no to him.
Right. Well, it's been suggested that there had to be something to send him over the edge at the end, and that looks like the most tangible thing. If in fact his hopes were on getting into the Marines, I tend to think, I'm not sure, the question might have to be rephrased. I mean, it's not when they decided to do this exactly, because they were planning it for a very long time. The question is what made it real. It had been this consuming fantasy. I mean, there was an awful lot of preparation that went into this for months.
Absolutely.
And also reflects, I think, on their lifestyle in a way. I mean, having the opportunity to go to Wyoming and buy fireworks and make pipe bombs and go out at night and test these things. One thing that runs through the story is this sort of absence of adults somewhere in the story.
Quick comment from Brian, and we must pause. Brian.
Well, I'd certainly agree with that, and I think maybe Hitler's birthday had something to do with the timing, but I don't know when it became real. It seems to be a long time before this.
Which would be contrary, because he talks in his diary that I've read, Harris talks about how he hates bigots.
Yeah. I mean, the Hitler thing is puzzling, and there's probably more about the birthday that we could learn from the diary the sheriff's office has. All I know about the Hitler connection is this natural selection thing that he talks about.
He has one of the shirts. Does he have a shirt on that says natural selection?
Some kids said he had that on when he died. He did have a T-shirt that said natural selection.
Here we go. It's 7:35. It's 25 minutes before 8. What was on the air, and maybe we'll try and recreate that, what you talked about off the air. The principal, Frank DeAngelis, of the school, and you were telling me that everyone has seen that picture of the so-called trench coat mafia that the principal denied knowing about. And now,
well, yeah, I mean, I'm not. He's sort of modified his or clarified what he said, but what he said essentially was he didn't know that there was something called the trench coat mafia. Then he said, well, I knew there were kids in dusters, but he said he didn't know about the harassment claims that they had about being singled out. And there are some issues with that. I mean, some parents question that quite a bit.
You know, Brian.
Well, yeah, he was lying. You know, he said right after the shooting that he didn't know anything about him. Now, months later, he's come back and said, well, gee, maybe I knew.
But talk about he had to know people were expelled, right?
There are several people in that photo who expelled, flunked out, suspended. I mean, these are disciplinary issues.
How did he not know who they were? I mean, I'd never heard that till you told me that off the air.
Yeah.
And that infamous picture that we all see now of the so-called trench coat mafia, numbers of those kids were suspended, kicked out, flunked, right?
Right.
And he says he didn't know who they were?
Well, I guess, he might say, I can't put words in his mouth, but I think he was saying he wasn't aware of it as a group. And it's sort of like, well, how many of these kids in black dusters do you have to see before you start wondering what this might mean? What kind of...
Or see them fail.
What kind of statement is this?
But you made a point, I don't know which one of you, I was listening to both of you once, made a point that under no circumstances was there any discipline ever taken against who?
Against the jocks. At least as near as we can tell, nothing ever happened to them. The other kids were singled out maybe for the right reasons, but of course DeAngelis knew about the group and knew about the kids who were expelled.
He never once against the jocks.
As near as we can determine, that's never happened. Now, we've asked for how many kids were expelled and all. We asked a couple months ago, and when I say we, it was a group of parents of whose kids were murdered or injured, and they have not answered even one of those questions.
Move on to... if you would, to Dylan Klebold. I asked Brian this, and this is one of those relative questions, and again with Brian here, it's very difficult. You say, who was the craziest kid? Which one of these was the one? And I was always under the impression it was Eric Harris. Brian, you have a different fix.
Oh, my belief is that it was probably Klebold. I think he's the one who went over the edge and convinced Harris to do it. Now, I'm saying that only from the information I have. I don't have any knowledge that happened. That's what it appears likely.
Alan, tell us about what you learned about Klebold.
Well, the standard line on Dylan is he's a follower. Many people had a hard time reconciling the person that they knew because he had a wider circle of friends, I think, than Harris did. Reconciling that with this kid on the rampage. I mean, he knew some of these kids. He's drifted between these different strata at the school. But I think if you really look closely at the relationship between him and Harris, I don't know which one's the leader and the follower, but I think the relationship explains a lot these are two guys who are on this downward spiral together, and they are falling behind socially in a certain way. I mean, there are lots of their friends who it turns out did not know them that well the last few months because these other kids were going on and dating and doing other things, and these guys were still sitting around playing Doom and running around doing pipe bombs. And the more that they spend their time just in each other's company, the more isolated in some ways they become from other people. And you have to see them as sort of dipping into this fantasy together and maybe not coming out. I mean, to what extent each of them was responsible and you know, which one was taking the lead, I can't say. But
we have sat in newsrooms and homes, and I'm sure we're no different than anybody else, and said, how did it begin and who triggers it and what happened? One of the things that's been believed is that because Harris was rejected by the Marines, that was the trigger to make the move. Brian, you say perhaps, but at the same time, you believe Klebold.
Yeah, I think and again, I don't have any evidence of it. I think he's the one who pushed it to say, hey, let's just do this. Let's become famous.
I think there's something here in terms of the relationship between the two boys and not fitting in and not being able to go on. At one point in the story, it's just maybe graduation is part of the problem. That there is a separation coming up and an uncertainty ahead, and their plans are not as concrete as others, and they can't make that real. I mean, Dylan's supposed to go to the University of Arizona. He goes down there and tours with his father, but there's something there that is making that seem like that's not ever really going to happen, and there is this final suicidal mission. I mean, I think the important thing about them is this thing that Harris wrote in his webpage one day. He says, we are more of a gang. You know, he's talking about who he and Dylan are. We plan out and execute missions. That's who we are.
It was written about missions.
Right, yeah.
This is the first time I'd seen this. Nathan Dykman, I think people remember Nathan Dykman. He made some money on this deal. But his 98 yearbook, now you brought me this, and you have the little shot of it in the new Westword. There's a little section of that page. But this is what Eric Harris wrote, although you print out what he wrote, but you show a little bit of it in the... Why is this significant?
Well, for a couple of reasons. Number one, this is
the page in the yearbook that Eric Harris wrote.
This is written a year before all this. And it's to a friend, and there's a lot of posturing that goes on in people's yearbooks. But it's amazing the number of things this touches on that says essentially, hey, look at who I am.
Yeah.
There's some German phrases saying, I am God, I know pity.
Yeah.
And there's stuff about doom and doom rules. Learn some Deutsch and never disrespect it or it will blow you up. I hate everything unless I say otherwise. Hey, don't follow your dreams or goals or any of that. Blank. Follow your animal instincts. If it moves, kill it. If it doesn't, burn it. He can't wait until he can kill people. I hate people. Kick some, take some, and get some. And at the bottom of the page, if you look closely at the drawings, there's a Zippo lighter.
Yeah.
Which is, you know, his trademark as a bomb man who sneaks out at night and vandalizes houses and blows up property.
Somebody had to see that.
I mean, I'm sure other kids saw it. My point is not necessarily these kids were, you know, hiding something.
He's thinking about this way before.
But that in many ways, this did not stand out. This did not stand out at this school. People don't look at this as anything unusual. Lots of kids talk about stuff like this.
We're coming right back. It's 7:47. On with this piece. Two issues I thought were very chilling to me. One is the idea of when other students saw Klebold and Harris. Now, they'd already been in at least one firefight, and they were already shooting students. And you told a story about the kid who ducked because they saw guns and they didn't think it was abnormal.
Right. Yeah, they didn't think it was anything dangerous. He thought he was going to get hit with a paintball.
So he ducked.
So, yeah.
We have to, the people are thinking, aha, the long-awaited senior prank. But, you know, the degree to which people had ready access to firearms, people talked about stuff, the things going on in the school, staging explosions for videos. I think one report I read on the Rebel News Network once, Harris and Klebold show up doing the insignia of their news network in the grass and setting it on fire with lighter fluid. And this is all just, that's interesting graphics. Mm-hmm. You know, I mean, none of this stuff is questions like, you know, how should you be doing this?
Who's the kid that ducked, Brian?
I believe it was Mark Taylor, but I'm not sure. But I think that's who it was. And what I think is amazing about this is I think guns were there so often that no one thought anything about it. And this is after other school shootings, and the administration should have addressed this years ago.
What was the story about the teacher who came out to tell him to be quiet?
Right, that was a teacher in the library, at least the report I read. She didn't know what was going on. She thought it was just another video being made. She comes out to tell him to be quiet, and they start shooting at her.
They're killing people.
Right, they're killing people.
The students ran the school. That's part of what I got from you.
Well, that's a quote from Brian, actually. But I mean, I think the point I was trying to make is not that there weren't teachers or administrators issuing some kind of discipline. It's simply that there is a level at which adults were kind of irrelevant. That they were perceived as easy to manipulate, maneuver, and there were things going on in the school that reinforced that message. The thing about students seeing other students bullied and teachers not doing anything about it. The thing about
worshiping the jock.
Yeah, the athletes cutting in line in the cafeteria, and there's a teacher there supervising. They don't stop this.
Yeah.
So there's a message that certain people can get away with things. Not everybody.
You said there's.
I don't think somebody could carry a gun into that school every day and not be questioned about it. Okay, but I do think there's a level at which there was a great deal of leeway for people to operate. Just look at some of the reports. One of these kids that was interviewed that was not there that day, she was at a tanning salon that day. I mean, it's like, what?
Wow.
This is a little different from high school as I remember it, in terms of the absences, in terms of the movement on and off the campus, in terms of all this kind of stuff.
But you make this point again about cutting in lunch lines.
Yeah.
If you were a big, tough jock, you just push a kid aside and you got your lunch, you didn't have to wait in line.
Well, not only that, you brought all your friends with you.
Yeah, and the teacher would stand there and watch it.
Yeah. I think there was selective enforcement of their so-called zero-tolerance policy for harassment, and that certainly plays into this somehow.
Did Principal DeAngelis know this was happening?
He had to know it was happening. There's no question. If you ever went through that school, I think in one day you could pick up all the things that are wrong with it. And so he had to know about this. But, of course, he was a coach, so he loved the jocks, too. So they were his priority.
You make the case, and I forget who it is saying this to you about them worshiping kids.
Yeah.
Certain kids get worshipped.
Yeah, that was Victor Good pointing out that they have these assemblies. I mean, there's no question there's this message about the jock culture throughout there. They have all these trophies in the front of the place. School assemblies were always about athletics, not about anything else. And you were required to be assembly, and you were there to, join in the school spirit. I mean, one of the most revealing things to me was a video that aired on the network of the soccer players going through the hallways, kicking their ball, kicking it into classrooms. This is while class is going on, and the teachers are supposed to play along and kick it back, and it's all a wonderful little school spirits bit. And it's like, well, where does the learning go on? What does this got to do with being in school?
Nothing. Absolutely nothing.
We'll come right back and wrap it up right after this on 630 KHOW. I'm Peter Boyles, Channel 7 and 11. Another shooting. You see it in the red newspaper boxes around town. Please get this. The Enemy Within, the lessons and the lies of the Columbine tragedy. And Brian, of course, lost his son there. They will both be with us on the morning Columbine opens. They'll be guest co-hosting the show. I guess the final questions, and certainly to Alan, to you, what is the lesson?
Well, I think the fundamental lesson is that we may not understand everything that happened with these two kids, but there was a whole context to the way they went down this road, and the district and the school probably has to come up with better ways of identifying violent and disturbed kids in their midst. There were lots of signs and lots of things that came out before this, but it just was not recognized as such.
The thing that I came away with, my thoughts after reading your piece, was how powerful the athletes were in that school.
Yeah, I think that's part of the context. I don't want to turn the story into one in which these two were the victims.
No, not at all.
Who snapped and came back and did this.
Not at all.
But that sort of sets the stage for this kind of resentment to be so widespread that these particular kids and their particular fantasies don't seem all that unusual.
Brian, what's the lesson?
Well, I think the lesson is that we had all the evidence up front that something was going to happen. and no one did anything. Jefferson County sheriffs, they ignored death threats. You know, these were 2 criminals, and they completely ignored it.
Thank you both. God bless. I'll see you guys both on the 16th.
Thank you.
Not actually, Brian will see you before that, and Alan will talk. Thanks, you guys. All right, it's 8 minutes after.